Hello everyone on this first session of the second day of our conference, which will be dedicated to the topic of naturalism and the philosophy of mind. We shall begin with the first presentation by Antonius Kaldas. I hope I pronounced it right. Who is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, Sydney, and St. Cyril Coptic Theological College in Sydney, Australia. And he also, as I found on the internet, has served as a parish priest of Archangel Michael and Saint Bishoy Coptic Orthodox Church in Mount Druitt, Sydney, Australia since 1991. He was previously a medical doctor, and now he recently published a book, To Become One, an Orthodox Guide to Engagement and Marriage. I hope this is all correct information. So, Antonius, we have your presentation recorded, but before we will start, could you just welcome us, say like 2 or 3 words to say hi to us?
Yes, thank you very much for allowing me to be with you virtually. It is a pleasure. I've enjoyed the talk so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the day today as well. And I hope some challenging questions and discussion points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are also very glad to have you here. So I will now share my screen with you, and hopefully everyone can see the presentation. Is it on the screen? Yep. Just allow me to.
The most interesting problem in the universe. This was the title of a 2014 paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies by Keith Tarowski. The problem to which he refers is the problem of consciousness, or more specifically, the hard problem of consciousness, as Australian philosopher David Chalmers has christened it. We live in an age in which the confident optimism of late 19th century that we have explained nearly everything that can be explained has given way piece by piece to the stark realization of how little we really understand the nature of reality. At the end of the 19th century, Newtonian mechanics and electromagnetic theory gave the illusion that we had explained everything about the physical universe there was to explain. But this illusion soon melted away, like the last bit of ice cream on the stick, falling into our laps and leaving us covered in the sticky mess of relativity and quantum physics. We still don't know how both of those theories, one of the very large, the other of the very small, can both be true. And yet for Tarowski, there is an even more interesting problem, one that seems to us today to be substantially more impenetrable than a grand unified theory in physics. And that problem is you and me. What is phenomenal consciousness? It is something that all of us know better than we know anything else, bar none. In Thomas Nagel's ubiquitous phrase, it is the mystery of what it is like to be you, the first person, utterly private experience or feeling of being you from moment to moment. The difference between you and a perfect mechanical walking, talking facsimile of you. Your stream of conscious experience. Just what is that? Why is it like anything at all to be you? Why are you a self-aware subject instead of a simple objective event? And how does consciousness come about? And where does it fit in our view of the universe? This is, of course, by no means a modern problem. Ancient peoples pondered the nature of the soul. The Egyptians labored long and hard to build pyramids that embody their beliefs about the soul and its fate. The classical Greek philosophers developed a variety of ways of explaining the soul. And indeed, throughout history, every culture and every civilization has had its own views. While these concepts of soul don't necessarily match up perfectly with the modern conversation around consciousness, there is, I think, enough to establish a continuity. One crucial step was taken by René Descartes in the 17th century. His sharp dualism of body and soul, echoing that of Plato, set the tone for much of the Western thought that followed. Among other things, having separated soul from body, he made it plausible to conceive of the body operating without the soul, and thus lay an unintentional foundation for the materialism about consciousness that dominated the 20th century. Descartes, however, was not really a cause, but a symptom of the metaphysical dualism that was engulfing Enlightenment Europe. Contrary to the holism of pre-modern times, reality was divided into an almost Gnostic ground floor of the physical universe and a separate upper story of the heavenly or immaterial realm. Rather than being immanent in every atom, God was, in Bette Midler's melodious words, watching us from a distance. Having relegated God, angels, and souls to the upper floor, it became possible to dispense with that upper floor altogether. After all, where is it? We can't see it. And conceive of the universe in purely material and naturalistic terms. Or, as some have said, having divided phenomena into the categories of natural and supernatural, it became possible to jettison the supernatural altogether. The tale of human inquiry in the 20th century is a tale of burgeoning confidence that materialism, the view that atoms and energy bouncing around in space-time, are the only things that exist and nothing else. Gone were the days of superstitious belief in the supernatural, the immaterial, and the spooky. Materialism would prevail and ultimately explain everything. And yet, by the close of the 20th century, this confidence was seriously shaken, though not completely abandoned. Today it continues to become shakier. Physics, as I said earlier, faces more mysteries in 2024 than it did in 1900, and some of them are spooky. Einstein's skepticism of spooky action at a distance, quantum entanglement that seems to violate the laws of relativity that set an unbreakable speed limit of the speed of light on the transmission of information. This spooky action at a distance has now been established in the laboratory. And on some interpretations of quantum theory, it is only a conscious observer that collapses the wave function of quantum mechanics. This phenomenon is one of a number of reasons that led philosopher David Chalmers to seek alternatives to reductive materialism about consciousness. In Joseph Levine's formulation, when we have explained everything we possibly can about the physical brain and body and all their functions, there will still remain an explanatory gap, a residue that has not been explained. This hard problem of consciousness, easy problems, by the way, are things like how we remember things or how we do sums in our heads. And actually, they've turned out to be not quite so easy either. But this hard problem of consciousness is getting harder, not easier. The field has seen something remarkable in the 70-odd years since materialism about consciousness reached its peak popularity in the 1950s and 60s. For one, materialist theories of consciousness have made precisely zero progress in cracking the solution. Zero. And that's not for any lack of effort. The list of proposed explanations continues to grow. global workspace theories, integrated information theories, higher order thought theories, recurrent neural networks, computationalism, functionalism, connectionism. I could go on. All of them tell us interesting things about how brains might work. None of them even begins to bridge Levine's explanatory gap. For example, higher order thought theories posit that when information in the brain flows back upon itself, loops back, and influences the next phase of information, that recurrence in itself is the explanation of conscious awareness. When one level of cognitive processing uses another level, that is where conscious awareness arises. But surely this happens all the time in computers, even the simplest of them, and yet no one thinks they are conscious. Why should one non-conscious phenomenon interacting with another non-conscious phenomenon, or even turning around and interacting with its own non-conscious self, not a real self in the human sense, of course, why should that give rise to conscious experience? The gap stubbornly remains. Given this stubborn impenetrability, a plethora of stranger theories have arisen, which tells us something in itself. I suspect that it is a law of inquiry that the number of viable theories about any given problem at any given moment is directly proportional to how impenetrable that problem is. Theories multiply when none of them work. Materialists appeal to theories such as non-reductive materialism, which relies on the somewhat spooky concept of emergence to bridge the explanatory gap, without having any real account of how such emergence might actually operate here. The quantum connection has led people to seek a quantum theory of consciousness, which at least has the advantage of having been creatively worked out by Roger Penrose and others, but this too has gone nowhere. With even less explanatory power, there are appeals to fictionalism. That is, we invent consciousness to explain things, but it never really happens. And illusionism. That is, we imagine being conscious when really we aren't. And even a kind of eliminativism, today's offspring of that ancient Eastern concept that the soul itself is not real and does not exist. Even that is making a comeback. Given the abject failure of materialism thus far, not only to explain consciousness, but to even show any signs that it is capable of explaining consciousness, increasingly inquirers are seeking an answer beyond the narrow confines of materialism. Dualisms of various kinds are respectable again. Yes, the soul is back. Even Berkeleyan idealism that posits that it is consciousness that is the reality, and that consciousness gives rise to material existences, even that is getting a run. And then there are my two personal favorite approaches, albeit for different reasons. Colin McGinn's idea of Mysterianism, on which it is impossible for a human consciousness to understand itself and must remain forever a mystery to itself. And Eric Schwitzgebel's crazyism, on which any explanation we end up with in the future is bound to be something that today would seem to us to be utterly insane. I've left the most interesting approaches till last in this whirlwind survey of theories. Panpsychism in its variety of forms. This is the idea that consciousness may be a part of the very fabric of reality in the same way that atoms and energy are. In fact, the view espoused by David Chalmers, Bertrand Russell's monism, posits that just as atoms and energy, two apparently quite different phenomena, are really the same entity deep down and convertible from one to the other through nuclear reactions, perhaps so also matter, energy on the one hand, and consciousness on the other hand, are really the same entity deep down, and possibly even convertible from one to the other, though not through nuclear reaction, but through some currently mysterious process that brains are terribly good at doing. I've called this approach interesting for two reasons. One, it is intrinsically fascinating, but two, it is building momentum and on the way to becoming the chief alternative to materialism in our contemporary arena of inquiry, which is astonishing, given that just a few decades ago, such ideas were considered to be fringe lunacy. The story of consciousness studies is a story that shakes our settled modern view of reality. If those who suspect consciousness is not the mere result of material processes are right, then we are going to have to revise our inventory of what is real, and some of it is going to be immaterial. And here's where things get really interesting. I have spoken with people who equate materialism with naturalism, but consciousness shows us that this need not be the case. A theory like panpsychism, if accepted, would force us to expand the definition of the natural beyond the material. We would have to make room for natural immaterial entities. The interaction problem that plagued Descartes' mind-body dualism would return. How on earth could we account for an immaterial phenomenon that causes material stuff to veer off the course dictated to it by the laws of physics and the sciences that build on physics? That is an interesting problem, and perhaps the spookiness we glimpse in quantum physics may offer an avenue for beginning to explore it. But today I'm interested in another problem, a kind of second-order problem. What impact would a theory like panpsychism have on the nature-supernature dichotomy? What happens when things we consider paradigmatically supernatural, like souls, end up being accommodated within an expanded or inflated view of nature? On the surface, this looks like yet another case of the God of the Gaps. A supposedly supernatural phenomenon turns out, on further investigation, to just be a new natural phenomenon. The inventory of nature increases at the cost of a shrinking supernature. But there is another way to approach this, and one that goes back to classical times, that to me makes far more sense. Perhaps it is not a false and retreating supernature that is the problem, but the nature-supernature dichotomy itself that is the problem. People like to seek the divine in the gaps in our knowledge, but why on earth should God dwell only in the gaps? If, as Paul quotes Hesiod, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, and, as we pray in the Orthodox Church, is everywhere present and fills all, then everything is causally divine in some sense, the laws and operations of nature no less than the miraculous appearance of a long-dead saint to a multitude. Many scholars have pointed out that the sharp nature-supernature dichotomy is largely a product of modernity. 'Twas not ever thus. In Eastern Christianity, two other kinds of distinction predominated. One was the distinction of the creator from the created. All phenomena, whether quotidian or miraculous, belong under the heading of created. The etymology of the very term miracle reflects this. It is not something that breaks the laws of nature, as the early modern David Hume would define it, but something so rare as to inspire wonder and awe. But deep down there is a kind of monism, uniting the common to the wondrous. Another distinction used particularly by the Cappadocian Fathers and Gregory Palamas, among others, is that between the essence and the energies of God. God in his essence is ineffable, unapproachable, unknowable. But his energia, his action in the world, is accessible to some degree to us. And once again, it is this latter category that equally subsumes both the common, the natural, and the miraculous. Either category, the created or the divine energies, would subsume both the material and the immaterial creation. We have no need for a second story, an upper invisible realm. We live in a one-story universe with no stairs to perplex us. But that single story continues to amaze and dumbfound us, becoming ever more beguiling. The more we know, the more we realize how much we do not know. The story of consciousness teaches us at least two things. First, that materialism is increasingly unlikely to be true, even if you are a naturalist. But also second, that the Christian need not strive to establish the reality of the supernatural, as if her faith depended on it. An appropriately expanded nature is more than enough to witness to the infinite, ineffable divine wisdom that it clearly reflects. We can call this new nature, or we can say that nature and supernature have finally been reconciled in a kind of monism. In the end, it doesn't really matter which. What seems certain is that our view of reality is by no means settled. I said earlier I am a fan of Erich Schwitzgebel's crazyism about consciousness. Any explanation of consciousness we end up with in the future is bound to be something that today would seem to us to be utterly insane. And I think this principle is transferable to how we think about nature and supernature. It is far too early to predict the imminent demise of narrow naturalism that predominates the first world today, or even the demise of narrow materialism. There remain many scientists and philosophers who hold out hope that someday, somehow, given we work hard enough and long enough, we will find a satisfactory materialist explanation for consciousness. But these voices are slowly losing ground and even credibility. Some even propose positive arguments for the impossibility of a materialist theory of consciousness, such as the unavoidable incongruity inherent in explaining an intrinsically subjective and first-person phenomenon in the intrinsically objective and third-person language of science. The mystery of consciousness turns out not only to be the most interesting problem in the universe, as Tarowski claims, but also a problem that promises to radically reshape our view of the universe, away from the materialist foundations that dominate modernity until now, and back to a more holistic and, to be frank, far more interesting perspective that the ancients understood far better than we.
Antonio, thank you very much for this presentation.